I'm Paul Quigley. I am in the history department at Virginia Tech. I teach history. I'm an associate professor, but I'm also director of the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies, and the center is sponsoring tonight's event. This is an important part of what we do. We sponsor lectures just like this one throughout the year, but we also host academic conferences as well. We do multiple outreach events in places like museums, elementary schools. We fund fellowships and student grants, lots of other good stuff as well. And I invite you to check out our activities at our website, civilwar.vt.edu. And I made it really easy for you to find the website with the banner down here. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. And again, I encourage you just to check our activities out. And I'm sure you'll find lots of other things you're interested in as well. Well, over the next few months, we've got a really exciting roster of speakers coming up. The topics range from naval sabotage during the Civil War to women and slavery in Washington, D.C., to the families of Philadelphia African-American soldiers who fought for the Union. And all of those lectures actually are part of a new series, a speaker series we're doing this year called New Perspectives on the Civil War Era. And I'm co-organizing the series with the center's postdoc, Dr. Caroline Newhall. And we're really excited to be able to present emerging voices. Yes, there you are. Thank you, Caroline. Emerging voices, up-and-coming scholars of the Civil War era. And today's speaker, Dr. Matthew Christopher Hulbert, is part of this series, and he qualifies. He's an assistant professor at Hampton-Sydney College, not too far out of his University of Georgia PhD program. But even though he's an up-and-coming scholar, he has already published 4 books. He's authored or edited these 4 books. 2 of them are on the subject of film and memory, very appropriate for tonight. And even though it's an online event, I brought a prop along with me. One of those books is called Writing History with Lightning, and it's a collection of essays he co-edited with John Insko. And really, if you're here tonight and interested in slavery on the silver screen, I think you'll be interested in this collection of essays as well. So Dr. Hulbert is going to speak for about 35 minutes, and that's going to leave us plenty of time for discussion. We will wrap things up by about 8:15, so about an hour and 15 minutes altogether. And for the discussion, I encourage you to ask questions through the Q&A feature of Zoom. So you won't be able to turn your camera on and speak. Unfortunately, you won't be able to type things into the chat box, but the Q&A box is where you will be able to ask questions, give us your comments. And you can do that at any time. One of the nice things about, an online talk rather than an in-person one is when a question occurs to you, type it into the box. You don't have to interrupt the speaker, and then the questions will be there for us to view and answer as many of them as we can at the end of the lecture. So that's all from me. Let's give a virtual round of applause to Dr. Hulbert and pass things over to him. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Quigley. And I would like to just thank you first for inviting me to talk with you about films this evening. Anyone who knows me knows this is sort of a dangerous proposition, because once you get me talking about movies, it can be difficult to get me to stop. Dr. Quigley and I thought about initially narrowing the focus of today's talk down to a cluster of films or even a particular theme. But in a student eval, I was once called, as a compliment, I'll preface, a militant film nerd. And the militant film nerd in me has a very hard time narrowing lists of movies. They tend to just get bigger and bigger. And Dr. Quigley was kind enough to let me have a go at a full century's worth. So I'd also like to thank all of you for attending virtually. I know that Zoom fatigue is a real thing. So I will do my best to keep things moving along briskly and to keep you entertained, and I will leave plenty of time, as Dr. Quigley noted at the beginning, for Q&A, and I hope we will be able to explore lots of different facets of what the talk delves into this evening. As I alluded to just a moment ago, we're going to take a 100-year tour of slavery on the silver screen. Hopefully no one is humming the Gilligan's Island, the 3-hour tour. I promise it won't be anything like that. In fact, you might think of the Great American Movie Ride at MGM, but instead of Indiana Jones or Alien, we will start in 1915 with D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, and we will conclude in 2016 with Nate Parker's equally controversial film of the same title. And unfortunately, instead of Robert Osborne, you are stuck with me this evening. Now, before we get started, I will say that my goals are twofold this evening, and we will revisit these periodically through the talk, but very much so at the end of the talk. The first is to give you just a broad overview of the major trends and thematic evolutions of what we've seen in these pictures, of what we've seen from slavery on the silver screen. And the second is to take stock of how much has really changed and how much really hasn't changed in the way we depict the peculiar institution over the last 100 years of movie making. So I am going to do something dangerous and press a button on here. I'm going to hit share screen, and hopefully this will take us where we want to go. If not, it'll be just like MGM when the ride breaks down. All right, I think we are in good shape. I'm getting a nod and a thumbs up. Okay, so for sake of recounting our progress this evening, we're going to divide the century into pre and post civil rights movement, and then we will divide the films themselves into pro and anti-slavery camps. And with that system of categorization in mind, it will really come as no surprise to many of you in the audience this evening that pro-slavery films, which are heavily influenced by the Dunning interpretation of Reconstruction and the lost cause, broadly writ, these are the films that dominate, by and large, the pre-civil rights era. And a lot of that has to do with one particular film released in 1915, and that is D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. This is going to lay the foundation for many of the tropes that will characterize pro-slavery films into the 1950s. So the influence of this film in its day is difficult to overstate, but it's also very important for us to keep in mind just how influential it keeps being even outside of its own era of Hollywood. Now, as many of you know, the film uses a before and after look at the Civil War to compare Southern society and to underscore for its Jim Crow audience that slavery had in fact been a positive good for both sides of the color line. And much to the dismay of African communities throughout the United States, some of whom actually attempt to have screenings of the film banned because they believe it promotes and incites violence, The Birth of a Nation very much glorifies paramilitary violence and lynching as the proper way to reestablish race relations. For those of you who have not seen Birth of a Nation, I will give you a pro tip. Because the film is silent and because recording equipment in the early 20th century captured images slower than what we see today, if you play the film in fast forward, you will actually watch it in something like people moving in real time. So don't be put off by the fact that it's 3 hours plus in its original format. You can actually watch it much quicker than that. Now, as we move into the 1930s, we are going to see films like Jezebel, pictured here, which starred Betty Davis and a very young, almost unrecognizably young Henry Fonda, and films like Gone with the Wind, pictured here, starring Vivian Leigh and Clark Gable. These are the direct inheritors of those tropes that The Birth of a Nation sets down as a foundation. They very much take their narrative cues from Griffith. Both of these movies are going to include paternalistic white plantation masters. They include contented and loyal slaves. And they go out of their way to screen the chaos that is supposedly unleashed when crass, greedy Yankee invaders show up and meddle in Southern society after the Civil War. These films are immensely popular. Between them, they win several Oscars. But what they really do for a generation of Americans is they put a Hollywood sparkle on the elite Southerners who maintain the institution of slavery. And for American moviegoers, and especially those from the North or the Midwest who are not as exposed to sort of the cultural artifacts of slavery on a daily basis, this is going to help these moviegoers fall in love with these larger than life characters who really cannot be separated from their Moonlight and Magnolia lifestyles. If you ever want to go down this pop culture rabbit hole, go on eBay and look at some of the Gone with the Wind stuff, that was produced during the film or subsequent international releases. There are plates, there are silverware, there are action figures, there's posters, there's dolls, there's anything you can possibly imagine. And they really just reflect the reach of these films and this specific view of Southern society that they're laying down as a blueprint that many moviegoers are going to assume is based in some way on reality. Now, because these films are immensely popular, it also shouldn't surprise us that a 1935 picture like So Red the Rose fails abysmally at the box office because it didn't get the memo. So Red the Rose features a very emotional slave revolt scene. It has a very dramatic manumission scene, and it almost goes out of its way to present a different caricature of Southern society as it is pillared by slavery, and people simply don't like it. So it sort of goes against the tide that Griffith first set in motion, and it will suffer for it in terms of take at the box office and film returns. Now, so far, we have mostly been talking about films that would be screened by adults. Some of you might remember being 7 or 8 and trying to sit through Gone with the Wind with your grandparents. It's a hard sell for a young child, but Hollywood understood this. And as this view of Southern society became more prevalent on film, this fashionable portrait that we see of the Old South is also going to trickle down to the youth market. So in 1935, Fox will release a pair of Shirley Temple films, The Littlest Rebel and The Little Colonel, both of which co-star Bill Robinson, who you might know better as Mr. Bojangles, who is a pioneer in dancing, especially tap dancing on stage. And these films give viewers a very friendly, benign take on the master-slave relationship. If you've spent much time in the archives looking at what's left of slave ledgers and auction descriptions, generally we don't stop for a slow descending tap dance scene down the stairs, but that's very much what Shirley Temple is selling us slavery looks like on a daily basis. A decade later, the film from which the still on your right comes really sets the hook on an entire generation. And by that, I mean Disney basically dangles lost cause bait in front of a generation of children, and they go for it hook, line, and sinker. This is, of course, Song of the South, which you might not have seen because it is much more difficult to find in its entirety. Song of the South is based on a compendium of Uncle Remus stories that are created by an Atlanta newspaper editor named Joel Chandler Harris. And generally speaking, they star Remus, pictured here, who is a lovable, loyal former slave. And in the course of telling stories to his former owner's grandson, the little boy in the sort of awful velvet suit here, he essentially tells the child how great life had been before the Civil War, before emancipation, back when he had been a slave, back when everything was taken care of for him, and life was just slower and easier and much more enjoyable. Despite it essentially being exiled today, surprise, you can't watch Song of the South on Disney Plus. This grosses a very impressive $37 million in 1946. When your dollar went a little bit further at the box office, it even manages to win the Academy Award for Best Original Song. So if you've ever hummed Zippity Doo Dah to yourself, or as the trailer for the film asked, if you have that Zippity Doo Dah feeling, you got that from Song of the South. Now, as audiences of different ages swooned over Rhett Butler not giving a damn, or Uncle Remus singing and dancing with all manner of animated animals and creatures, Hollywood is attempting to turn out anti-slavery pictures, but they really don't seem to have much hope of competing with the likes of Griffith or Victor Fleming or Walt Disney in segregated American theaters. Even Harry Pollard's very famous 1927 adaptation of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which itself is silent, but also followed silent versions of the film produced in 1910, 1913, 1914, and 1918. This sort of shows us that Uncle Tom's Cabin is the most powerful anti-slavery vehicle we have to put on screen, so we're going to try to do it over and over until one of them finally sticks. This was supposed to be the one. It is even billed as the movie that cost $2 million to produce. It was supposed to be a spectacle, and it simply could not mitigate the deep roots put down or the effects put down by the birth of a nation. We can talk about this a little bit more, I hope, in the Q&A as it pertained to the actors themselves and the use of blackface. Later films, after seeing the dismal production of Uncle Tom's Cabin and other anti-slavery pictures at the box office, they're almost going to go out of their way to make a mockery of abolitionism, and they will often do that in the form of a wild-eyed John Brown. So 1940s Santa Fe Trail, both of these screen stills come from Santa Fe Trail. It stars Raymond Massey as an overly militant, uncompromising Brown, righteous to the point of self-destruction, and he will reprise that same role in 1955 for another film called Seven Angry Men. Both of these pictures, but especially Seven Angry Men, are clear responses to the gathering push for civil rights. Seven Angry Men is released just 1 year after the Brown decision comes down from the Supreme Court, and they're going to typecast Northern abolitionists as troublemakers and intruders who essentially fail to understand the positives that the racial hierarchy of Southern society has for African Americans themselves. Brown is very much pictured as a guy in these movies who does more harm to African Americans, to enslaved African Americans, than he does on their behalf. And that is driven home toward the end of Seven Angry Men when Brown's own sons basically disown him. They disapprove of his violent message and they abandon him. Now, not everybody gives up on anti-slavery pictures. 2 years after Seven Angry Men, Warner Brothers is going to adapt Robert Penn Warren's novel Band of Angels for theatrical release, and they go big in the casting department. So Clark Gable, who is still a marquee name at this point, is going to headline the film, and it's also got a heavyweight director in Raoul Walsh. But despite this, the film is going to fare very badly with ticket buyers, and it essentially tanks at the box office. The plot revolves around Gable's character, who is a slave owner, but one who is open to the dark side of slavery. He is not sort of the unmoving devil who just can't see that slaves are actually people. And he basically enters into a romance with a Southern belle played by Yvonne DiCarlo, who partway through the picture learns that she is in fact herself mulatto and that she is a slave. So Clark Gable buys her and their romance ensues. As they fall in love, the moral of the story, which sort of is a little on the nose, but it's the pure artificiality of the color line. This is mostly lost on audiences right in the aftermath of the 1954 Brown decision. and as massive resistance takes hold throughout the Deep South. Critics, regardless of where they are located, do not appreciate the plot of Band of Angels. They basically saw miscegenation on screen as a cheap ploy to sell tickets. This was sort of shock value before we would think of shock value the way that we do today. They assumed people were either going to go see this so they could be outraged at the miscegenation, or that people would think that's the greatest thing I've ever seen in terms of politics for the miscegenation. But they're assuming you're either going to love it or hate it, and you probably knew before you bought the ticket. Little did those critics know, however, what was coming by the time we get to the late 60s and early 70s, because in the immediate wake of what we might consider the nonviolent or the mainstream civil rights movement, and then the Black Power and the armed self-defense movements, we will get a new genre of films featuring slavery, and they will fall under the umbrella of blaxploitation. These films are an outgrowth of a broader genre of blaxploitation. So if you've seen the original Shaft from 1971, or Superfly from 1972, or Foxy Brown from 1974, you have a pretty good idea of the style of these pictures, and that style inevitably bleeds over into plots involving slavery and involving the Old South. These films really did just attempt to sell tickets through shock and awe, and they also made a point of hiring Black actors and Black athletes in lead roles, and then allowing anti-hero protagonists to wield very over-the-top violence against white masters. So starting with Slaves, the film poster for which is on the far left in 1969, these pictures are going to highlight racism in very sexual ways. Sex sells today, sex sold in the late 60s and early 70s. Two, this will generally involve interracial romances and very explicit rape scenes. So Slaves, which stars O.C. Davis and Dionne Warwick, strikes a chord with disillusioned Black audiences who weren't getting what they wanted to see of their own culture from Hollywood. And we will see a wave of films featuring these graphic revenge plots that are very much laced with sex. Goodbye, Uncle Tom, Quadroon, the Charlie films, and most famously, the one that hopefully some of you are familiar with, Richard Fleischer's Mandingo, which is released in 1975. The film stars the very venerable and apparently very broke James Mason as there are various explanations for why Mason would agree to be in Mandingo. Tax problems seem to be the most prevalent answer, but regardless of why he takes the role, he plays a psychopathic plantation owner, and he is opposite former heavyweight boxing champion Ken Norton, who plays a slave named Meade. The movie features unbridled racism, Mandingo fighting, rape, interracial sex, group sex, and infanticide, and one of the strangest endings in Hollywood history. This picture with the pot comes from the end of Mandingo, but I'm not going to explain it. You just have to watch it for yourself to even begin to understand what's going on in this image. The film critic, Roger Ebert, calls Mandingo, quote, manure and racist trash. But the blaxploitation era, despite not winning over elite film critics or film aficionados, is going to serve as a necessary counterweight to the Moonlight and Magnolia films of the past, to Jezebel and Gone with the Wind and The Birth of a Nation. And because we now have these two opposite poles in the way we depict slavery on film, this is going to help force Americans somewhere back into the middle. We're going to have to find a more balanced and nuanced way to tell the slavery narrative. And that process will really begin in the 1990s. So in 1995, Miramax releases The Journey of August King. If you have never seen The Journey of August King, you are not in the minority. Miramax was a much smaller studio than it is today. And the movie is the first to address Appalachian slavery on film, but it lacks any of the grit or the sex or the violence of blaxploitation. And because of that, it was very difficult to get it in front of audiences. I used to joke with my doctoral advisor, who Paul mentioned at the beginning of the talk, John Insko, that in showing Journey of August King to his Southern history class every year, over the years, he has probably actually screened it for more people than Miramax did. So they should figure out a way to pay John some sort of royalty. Regardless of that, 2 years later is really when we get into this reconsideration phase with slavery on film, and that comes with Steven Spielberg's Amistad. This is a star-studded courtroom drama. It features Morgan Freeman, Anthony Hopkins, Matthew McConaughey, and it breaks new ground by showing the horrid conditions of the Middle Passage and the roles played by Africans themselves in the slave trade. I wish I was technologically capable of showing you that sequence from the Middle Passage. It's disturbing and it's heartbreaking, and it really sort of gives you an idea of what the conditions you read about in textbooks might have looked like. It's not a perfect representation, no film is, but it gives you a pretty good place to start. And I do hope we can address the inclusion of Africans themselves in the promulgation of the slave trade during the Q&A, if that comes up. But after the popularity of Amistad and the sort of unappreciated release of The Journey of August King, Southern slavery is going to disappear from Hollywood studios for more than a decade. And when it reappears in 2012, it comes in the form of two films with very large budgets and very unconventional plots. I am talking about Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter and Django Unchained. So the former of those two pictures depicts President Lincoln as a cross between Van Helsing and John Wick. He wages a secret supernatural war against a confederacy of slave-devouring Southern vampires. There's an apt metaphor there. It's a little clumsy. Lots of people get chopped with axes. But by and large, this was considered an entertaining and relatively successful film. Django Unchained, which came out that same year, represents a clear nod to the blaxploitation films of the 70s, and it follows a former slave turned gunslinger as he exacts revenge on the sadistic plantation owner who has bought his wife. Audiences love Django even more than they love Abe Lincoln Vampire Killer, but the sense is that they enjoyed these pictures more for their body counts than for their nuanced depictions or explorations of slavery. Thankfully, if that is what you were looking for, you did not have to wait long. The very next year, filmgoers get a very realistic look at slavery through 12 Years a Slave. This is, of course, based on Solomon Northup's autobiography. And this film really set a new bar in terms of detailing the physical and emotional abuses and traumas that slaves had to deal with on a daily basis. So we see the degradation of human auctions, families torn apart, sexual assaults, vindictive masters, and really the overall commodification of human chattel. 3 years after 12 Years a Slave, Matthew McConaughey returns to the silver screen as another anti-slavery protagonist. This time, however, he does his work with a rifle, not with law books. I'm, of course, talking about The Free State of Jones, which was based on pioneering archival work done by the Civil War historian Vicki Bynum. The film essentially chronicles an interracial uprising in Jones County, Mississippi, the county that very famously attempted to secede from the Confederacy after Mississippi seceded from the Union. Despite action sequences and some actually pretty decent performances, the film received mixed reviews, and it was very quickly eclipsed by another anti-slavery film with a much smaller budget and far less studio fanfare. This one was written and directed by Nate Parker, who's in the very center of your screen here. 2016 was sort of the year of the wide angle shot with everyone lined up holding guns and knives. The movie chronicles the 1831 Nat Turner slave revolt in Virginia. It's not a wholly realistic recreation, but it's one that does two things better than any other cinematic rendering of slavery had ever done before. This is really the first picture that highlights the corrosive, dehumanizing aspect of white Southerners in their addiction to slavery. So you see the adverse effects that Jefferson had first talked about, obviously, centuries before this film was released. And we finally see in gory, slow motion detail why successful slave rebellions were virtually impossible to pull off in the antebellum South. Those of you who have taught a slavery course know the first question out of students' mouths halfway through that slavery lecture is, why didn't they revolt? This film cinematically gives you a pretty good mental image of why that was such a difficult thing to do. So, a century after D.W. Griffith's film about resurgent ex-Confederates and glorious Klansmen, this new birth of a nation wins double high honors at Cannes Film Festival and then sees its mass appeal essentially evaporate overnight. There are boycotts from within the African American community and from within prominent academic circles, and we can talk a little bit more about why in the Q&A if people would like to. Okay, I have done my best impersonation of Robert Osborne. We have come nearly up into the present in our movie ride. So with our remaining 5 minutes or so, let's make sense of all the movies we just saw. We see a very clear turning point in the collective tone and theme of slavery films after the landmark civil rights victories of the 50s and early 60s. Normal is going to pivot from pro-slavery to anti-slavery, and then a little bit later in the 1960s, Normal will pivot from either not depicting Black actors on screen or depicting them in blackface to actually giving serious African American actors lead roles and roles that don't ask them to pantomime lost cause tropes. So that don't ask them to be Gus the interracial rapist or Uncle Remus or Prissy or Mammy or Big Sam. By the time we get into the heyday of the counterculture, sort of the Vietnam and immediate post-Vietnam era, this is when it becomes more acceptable to depict the horrors of slavery in more graphic detail. A little bit of this has to do with loosening of censorship, but most of the time this has to do with blaxploitation and just pushing the envelope. And as violence and sexual content become more prevalent in anti-slavery movies, outright resistance to the institution as a plot element is going to grow. Though at first, this will just seem like violence for sake of violence. By the time we get into the 1990s and then later films, such as The Birth of a Nation, we'll finally see the daily lives of slaves being explored in a thoughtful way. We almost see more of a social history on screen than anything previously made by a Hollywood studio. And we finally start documenting the reasons slaves like Nat Turner might have had to rebel in real life. That said, the majority of Hollywood studios have shied away from depicting violence against the institution of slavery itself. And by that, I mean they don't like to show Black on white violence minus some sort of final straw or a trigger to the epic violence that takes place in movies like Django or The Birth of a Nation. So in Django, it is the theft of Django's wife, Broomhilda. In Birth of a Nation, it is the rape of Nat Turner's wife, Cherry, that prompt these epic quests of revenge. It is not the protagonist's default state of enslavement. So Hollywood, even today, oftentimes feels like enslavement itself is not bad enough to warrant the sort of violent pushback we see in these films. There had to be a personal breaking point or a personal last straw for the main characters. Now, at the same time, we can see studios grappling with how to deal with Black on white violence. The rise of these more thoughtful films is going to spark a contentious debate, and one that is still ongoing, over how to properly weigh the agency of enslaved peoples versus their so-called white saviors on screen. So as this image, or this slide, excuse me, will illustrate pretty clearly, virtually all of the anti-slavery films of the 90s, 2000s, and the more recent present, with the exception of The Birth of a Nation, they fit in some way under the umbrella of a white savior movie, which means the main character needs the aid or the benefaction of a white person to help them escape from slavery. They're not capable of doing it on their own. Abe Lincoln, Vampire Hunter, Django Unchained, they are more or less guilty as charged. In these movies, Lincoln and King Schultz, who is middle bottom on this slide, they kill lots of bad guys, and then they basically give their lives for the cause of Black freedom. And as unpopular as it is to let Matthew McConaughey especially off the hook for white saviorism on screen, what we see in the Free State of Jones, as well as 12 Years a Slave, is that as overacted as these roles might be, they are generally affirmed by the historical record. Amistad is probably the most problematic of all. Its legacy falls somewhere in between. So on one hand, the characters played by Anthony Hopkins and Matthew McConaughey, they reflect the real actions of real abolitionists in a courtroom, but they do a very poor job, on the other hand, of contextualizing those characters within the broader debate over slavery that was happening in America in the 1830s and 40s. There was a big difference, especially in the North and in New England, among everyday people who didn't think it was right to import more slaves, but who were still okay with other people owning slaves as long as they didn't really have to see it. From watching Amistad, you would get the sense that everyone is like John Quincy Adams and just finds the institution abhorrent. Perhaps the most telling observation of all that we can pull from this century worth of movie making is that of all the anti-slavery films that we saw produced between 1995 and 2016, only two of them, Vampire Hunter and Free State of Jones, actually have a plot that singles out the Confederacy as an attempt to preserve the institution of slavery. Now, to be clear, I don't mean to say that we should hold films that depict the 1830s or 40s or even the 1850s accountable for addressing something like the Confederacy that does not yet exist. It would make no sense for Soller and Northrop to be lamenting secession. But what I am saying is that we must remember that Hollywood is a business intent on making money, and one very adept at reading the proverbial room and then catering to the wants and needs of its paying audience. So based on the last 3 decades of filmmaking, it's clear to us that Hollywood believes Americans are willing to concede the evils of slavery, and we have become increasingly willing to pay to see a slew of anti-slavery films, many of which have won major awards and have made lots of money at the ticket booth. But it is also clear, for the most part, that studio executives do not believe that the everyday American is interested in connecting the dots between slavery and the Civil War, at least not enough to churn out many screenplays of that bent. So the idea that I will leave you with before we transition to Q&A is that in this specific case, and connecting slavery to the Civil War on screen, it's not really the movies we see that tell us the most about who we are and how much we've changed and how far we've come as a society since D.W. Griffith or Shirley Temple. It's actually the movies we don't see on the silver screen and the things that we are not yet willing to show. I will stop there, and let me see if I can minimize this. And I will turn it back over to Dr. Quigley, I think, for Q&A.
Thank you so much for a fascinating talk, and it's very impressive that you're able to cover so much ground, but without feeling rushed. I mean, I feel like you gave us a wonderful overview of this century of cinema here. We have already got a good bank of questions, but I encourage people to continue sending them in. Again, we may not get to them all, but we'll get to as many as we possibly can. And some of the questions I've noticed so far are asking about films and television shows that you didn't mention. And I think we can completely forgive you for not mentioning everything, especially television shows, which I think wasn't officially part of your remit. But several people are asking about Roots. I think mostly thinking about the original in 1977, but one person at least thinking about the remake just a few years ago. And most people seem to be wondering, you know, how does Roots fit into this cinematic timeline that you've given us?
Sure, that's a fair question. And if you had given me another hour, the militant film nerd in me, we could have worked in TV too. I think the participant number, we would have seen it plummet. But that's a totally valid question. And the thing that I would point to most is really the way we consume different forms of media. I don't know that it's fair to just say Hollywood films are the most powerful content, at least in the I could watch anything that I ever wanted to on my phone without cable or direct TV or having to go to the theater. And sort of the more traditional divide between television and movies, the majority of Americans, when you ask them to imagine a historical thing, they think of a movie. It startles my students when I say, imagine the American Revolution, what popped into your head? And sadly, sort of, for a lot of them, it's Mel Gibson, right, with the tomahawk. The same can be said of the war and slavery. So I think part of the reason I tend to prioritize these major studio releases is because I think they end up reaching more people. I think they tend to have more staying power than television. That's not to say that television can't be powerful. I would say Roots, or even the way the Ken Burns documentary, a little more than a decade and a half later, deals with slavery, sways many Americans. But I think there's just something about the experience of seeing things on the big screen that imprint them in our minds and sort of tell us, if we're going to take history from the silver screen and those are going to become the default, almost the clip art of the memories that we have but didn't experience, it's going to come from the movies. I also think from the business aspect, and then I will be quiet about this. The way you make money from a film or from a TV show worked a little bit differently, especially in the 70s or 80s. A miniseries like Roots is primarily going to be concerned with selling advertising. And because it's not a show that has to go on for several seasons, once the advertising is sold, you've made the money. It's nice to say that you had a lot of viewers, but that's not going to sway potentially the content you'd put on screen quite as much. With a film, I'm entirely beholden by people coming continuously after reviews have come out to give me their money. So I feel like in some ways they're a better reflection partially of what society is thinking, but also what Hollywood thinks society wants to see. That might have made it worse, but I will stop there.
No, I think that was a really good response to the question. Another kind of mini cluster of questions that I'm relating in my mind anyway, concern productions like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which of course in the 19th century and into the 20th was a very popular theatrical production. So we've got a couple of questions. One is, how do those early theatrical representations of slavery in the post-Civil War period go on to affect cinematic representations in the 20th century? And then one very specific question, which I'm intrigued to hear your answer to. Do you have any comments on the performance of Uncle Tom's Cabin as a play in The King and I in the 1950s?
Oh, now we're way into militant film nerd territory. I like this. So in terms of this transition from, really, I think if we go back even a step further, sort of a literary tradition of anti-slavery narratives, and then Uncle Tom's Cabin, because it is just it's hard for people to imagine what a literary sensation Uncle Tom's Cabin was. It only lost to the Bible in terms of sales. I mean, if you own two books, odds are good in America. You own the Bible and you own Uncle Tom's Cabin. You might have hated Uncle Tom's Cabin, but you bought it if you lived in Louisiana or Mississippi, so you could excoriate it. The weird thing about Uncle Tom's Cabin is that as powerful as it was, I mean, Lincoln, if we believe the story, and I kind of like to because I like Lincoln, he pins part of the war on her, right? You're the little lady that made this big war. That book was immensely powerful as abolitionist propaganda. But the theatrical versions, as widespread as they are, and there are sort of different levels, this could be performed at the local level. You could have a regional traveling company. You could have a fancy national level traveling company. But I feel like they don't necessarily achieve the potency that the book does, because you've got to live near a theater. Almost anybody can get a book, but you've got to live near a theater to see a performance of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So it's almost like we skip a medium in terms of its power, because it's much easier for someone to see a film in the 20s than it probably was for them to go see a high quality production of Uncle Tom on the stage. Now, there are obviously other issues here of blackface and sort of this earlier Jim Crow tradition of how Black characters are portrayed. And you can only imagine how bad some of the local performances of Uncle Tom's Cabin probably are in the late 19th century. But then as we move into film, unfortunately, it doesn't get all that much better. These are really difficult to track down, some of those very early silent versions. For a couple of them, I don't know that full reels even exist anymore. There are sort of snippets left that you can find on dark corners of the internet. But people really thought with Pollard's version, it's one of the best stories ever written. We've got all the money in the world. For the first time ever, we're going to have a Black man play Uncle Tom. All of the other characters, except for Uncle Tom, are white actors in blackface. But James Lowe plays Uncle Tom. So you had sort of this built-in gimmick / first-time thing. And it just didn't play. And I play with audiences. And I think part of that has to do with the fact, because people knew the story so well, there was partially, well, it could never be as good as the book. And then for a huge chunk of the country who immensely disliked Stowe and disliked Uncle Tom's Cabin, and who were still old enough to have experienced the war, they weren't going to buy tickets to go see that because they hated her, right? So it almost had too much baggage. Later version, so in the 50s, they add sound, and I think even one version they colorize, the 1927 version. And I think that was released on a limited basis on theaters. Raymond Massey, the same guy who played John Brown, actually does the narration there. That was more popular, but we had sort of crossed that civil rights threshold that sort of put the film in a new context. I could keep going on about this forever, but I'm going to stop. I'll let you ask another question.
Thank you. A different kind of question now, one you may have had before. If you could produce or direct or write a movie on this subject, the enslavement of African Americans, what kind of project would you embark upon? And then the wording of the next part, I think you might appreciate. Is there an incident or an individual that would satisfy the dysfunctional demands of Hollywood? So any kind of basis for a movie, I guess think of this as your pitch to a Hollywood executive who may be listening in the audience.
I also want to say to whoever asked about The King and I did not mean to leave you out of that last question. Email me and we can talk more about that. I don't think that's an accident that slips in there. There's definitely some ideological signaling going on there. I am torn on this because I feel like what we see the least of are realistic stories told about slavery from the Black perspective. I felt like the most recent Birth of a Nation really had a chance to change the way regular people thought about slavery, because it is just, if you've seen it, it is brutal. There are scenes that I can't watch again. One of them, I won't fully describe it, involves a chisel and a funnel, and it's just it's excruciating. And I feel like in some ways that's the kind of film that we need to just shock people out of, the traditional idea they have of slavery. But part of me just finds it unbelievable that we don't have a really good John Brown movie. And I know this sort of, again, diverts right back to that white savior umbrella, but of course, Brown, ends up saving people by failing. So I feel like you could that would be my angle on it, to sort of sneak out from under the white savior umbrella. But I've long thought, how is Woody Harrelson not John Brown? He's got kind of that wild look in his eye. I'm sure he could do a wacky accent for us. He's no stranger to killing things in Zombieland. I think that would be a really interesting vehicle. And it's really, I think, telling of the way people don't want to touch certain parts of slavery as it then connects to the war. Because how do you not make a movie about John Brown? I mean, he swings broadswords at people. He invades well, now as I think about this, I'm going to get in trouble saying he invades federal arsenals. Don't invade federal anythings. That's not good. You'll get in big trouble, rightfully so. Different context at Harper's Ferry. I'll stop there before I get into more trouble.
A couple of people are asking about a movie you haven't mentioned, Gods and Generals, a movie that's obviously not about slavery in any way, shape, or form, or doesn't purport to be. What do you make of films like Gods and Generals that continue to sort of perpetuate traditional views of enslaved people as either completely absent from the story or loyal to their slave owners?
So I'll preface this by saying Gettysburg is a guilty pleasure. The Civil War historian in me will watch Gettysburg whenever it's on at 2 a.m, when Gettysburg tends to come on. Gods and Generals is another story. I'm assuming I could say this on C-SPAN 3. Gods and Generals is just a horrible movie all the way around. And then when you throw in its depictions of slavery, it is cringeworthy. It's really bad. There's the one scene in particular that goes out of its way to just detach Lee and Jackson specifically, where they explain to a slave, we're really doing this for principle. We would free you. This has nothing to do with slaves. And if we win, we're probably going to free you anyway. It is just totally detached from reality. And it's sort of a reversion back to these lost cause fantasies that by and large, you don't see on this side of this. When we split our century in half, for the most part, you leave that behind after the 1950s. You still get sort of, I'm not saying lost cause goes away. That's very much alive in Civil War movies specifically, but just the overt, Marsh Robert was a great guy and he loved his slaves and he was going to let them go. It's just so bogus. It's painful. It's hard to believe that it ended up in a movie, frankly. I don't know how to condemn it more. It's just so bad. So yeah. But I guess I will say it's so bad. I don't know that people took it seriously. So maybe the silver lining was, people didn't really hear all the bad dialogue over the laughs.
A few people, just in response to what you were saying 2 questions ago about maybe a John Brown movie, a couple of people chimed in with references to The Good Lord Bird. Have you been able to see it yet? If so, what's your take on it?
This is the militant film nerd failing. And I will throw my 2 kids who are 4 and 2 under the bus. I have not been able to watch yet. But if Woody Harrelson couldn't be John Brown, Ethan Hawke would have been in the running, right? You've got kind of that Gen X offbeat 1,000-yard stare. So I feel like he would make a good John Brown. And that is on my list. This gets into a little bit, if I can take this on like a 1-minute tangent, the shifting mediums that we see. In the old days, you had film or you had TV. Today, we basically watch both on the computer, and neither exists as it did a decade ago. So it's hard to sort of decide the impact some of these have, because you have these like a Netflix series that wins awards, but then you find out a fraction of the people who might have seen Die Hard 4 in theaters, whenever that came out, is escaping me now, who ended up watching the shows, but as art, they're sort of esteemed. So I wonder if there's sort of this effect wherein the more popular something sounds on Netflix or Roku or Fire Stick, we assume it's reaching a bigger audience than it is, and maybe it's changing more minds than it is. I don't know. I'm actually that's sort of a Foucauldian thing that I'll just dump on everyone else and let them solve. I saw one person votes for Willem Dafoe. I don't know if I see him as John Brown. I don't know if he can ever be anyone other than Elias, running at the, halfway through Platoon through the jungle being chased. But he's a great actor.
Thank you. Question about audiences, and specifically African-American movie audiences. Have American audiences changed in their racial makeup over the decades? And maybe if so, what kind of effect has that had on the content of these movies about slavery?
I think they absolutely have. And I think part of this has to do with the theater business itself. And when you saw larger corporate chains basically swallow up, everybody dreams about, well, I won't say everybody, I dream about seeing movies in the old school theater that only had one stage, it had one screen, it had a balcony. It was almost an artwork unto itself, but it probably only seated 80 people, right? Today, you go to the Cinemax or the AMC, you go to one of these giant corporate theaters, and in the process of swallowing up these sort of private, independently owned theaters, or even drive-ins as well, pair that with the gradual desegregation of American society, and you're just giving access to watch films to more people than ever before. And part of the reason that I think films are so powerful as opposed to literature or television, I'm not telling you to watch movies instead of read books. You should especially buy edited collections about the 19th century South on film. But a movie requires a very short attention span, and it does the reading for you. You don't have to binge watch a season of The Birth of a Nation or a season of Gone with the Wind. If you can sit there for a couple hours with your popcorn and your cherry Coke, you're going to get the whole story laid out for you. You don't even have to think about it. Most movies tell you what you should think on your way out the door, and people seem to like that. In terms of African-American audiences, it's double-edged. Over the most recent decades since desegregation, African-American audiences have had more access to theaters. But as America writ large has had more access to theaters, and America is still very predominantly white, Hollywood studios are going to play to their largest consumer base. So even though African-American patrons can go to the movies more, they might not have all that much more say in what ends up on the screen, although I do think that is changing. I think in the last decade or so, especially as we see a blending of media between music and film, these used to be very separate businesses, but now you see Common and LeBron James and Jay-Z. You see people producing films who 20 years ago, this just would not have happened. So I think that will start to open up a little bit. But at the end of the day, despite what Hollywood wants to tell us at the Oscars or in press releases or in their Super Bowl commercials, at the end of the day, if it doesn't sell tickets, they're not going to make it. So it's really going to be a reflection of all of us that would open the door for those perspectives to show up on screen more.
Yeah, and I really appreciated the theme in your talk as well about the importance of Hollywood as a business, which knows its customers and does its best to satisfy their existing needs and desires. One of the questions, though, asks, even as movies reflect contemporary norms and social patterns that are already happening, do you also see movies as changing culture, society, politics as well?
Yes. Um, the way I try to explain this with students and the way John and Sco and I tried to explain it in the book, um, I see movies and culture working on a loop. Culture is basically the way we want to see ourselves or the way we imagine our society looking in the mirror, and in pop culture or artifacts of our broader culture. That's how we try to reflect those things. They're the artifacts of how we think, we appear. So when we project what we want to see of ourselves, Hollywood very smartly puts those things on film. And then the more we see them on film, it becomes self-fulfilling because we think, well, they put that on film because that's what we're like, right? Americans are like John Wayne because Hollywood said so. Hollywood said so because Americans in the 60s wanted to project that they were like John Wayne. So we get this sort of infinite loop that just grows and grows, but there's room for divergence. To throw another film reference in there, there are always movements thinking outside the mainstream box. New wave cinema, gonzo films, independent films. And now this is where these new mediums really take hold. I don't need a major film distributor to pick up my movie. I can sell it to YouTube, and more people can watch it in 2 days than will pick up the entire summer blockbuster season. It's not the same experience not seeing it on the big screen. So you might not internalize it the same way, but there are definitely ways to sneak alternative narratives in there. And over time, this is sort of the process we see. The things that used to be outlandish, I mean, think about the blaxploitation films and how shocking that was to poor Roger Ebert. I don't know what he would have said if you had shown him Django Unchained in 1975. He probably would have thought the exact same thing. But by the 20 teens, that was normal. What had once been, totally outside the box had been sort of corporatized. So that's the other process that unfolds in tandem. And I think that's what makes it hard to break the narratives that we cling to, is over time, we even absorb the ones that we didn't like or that we didn't consider as being mainstream, and we force them into the mainstream. So I'm not sure what's left that you could really shock people with, as it pertains to slavery. But over time, I'm sure we would sort of integrate that too.
Yeah, that reminds me of a question I was thinking about during your lecture. You mentioned those attempts in the 1930s and 40s to bring slavery to the youth market. Is there anything like that going on at the moment? Is it possible, given that recent representations of slavery have been so unflinching? 12 Years a Slave, for example, is not something you would want to show to a kid.
I think there is, but I think it's the components, or the logistics, I should say, are slightly different. Um, in the 20s or 30s or 40s, where you essentially had a children's pro-slavery genre, as creepy as that sounds to say out loud, you also had corresponding literature and you had corresponding school curriculum, especially in the Deep South. The UDC, as we know, from David Blight or Karen Cox or Carrie Janey, the UDC is heavily policing the way American school children digest slavery and the war. Today, we don't see as much of the pop culture pro-slavery element. As far as I know, at least, there are no mainstream cartoons, that are kind of telling kids slavery is okay. But you read about some of the textbook battles, and entire state curriculums that say slaves were migrant laborers, or they were like imported laborers, or that really try to sort of strip away the social traumas or the everyday problems faced by slaves. That to me seems like a bigger threat today than that coming through pop culture, which is so weird because usually we would think school undoes the things that you see on television or in the movies. But in this case, 12 Years a Slave or parts of Amistad or parts of Birth of a Nation might actually be undoing what you're getting in the school book in Texas or Oklahoma, or where some of these other debates are unfolding.
Another question along the lines of, what about this movie that you didn't mention? One that I think you expected, which is the recent movie Harriet. Several people are curious about your take on Harriet. One way to pose the question might be, isn't this the movie about slavery that we've been waiting for 100 years?
It is and it's not. And I promise, because we're not at a conference, I won't do it's not my century. I won't use the chronological cutoff to get away from this. At first look, yes, Harriet attaches the issue of slavery or the survival of slavery to the war. We have an African American character who dominates a finite share of agency in that film and is willing to wield violence, but not in an over the top sort of Django or blaxploitation way. My question with Harriet is the reach of the film. And this is part of where these new mediums and this blurring of technology and how we can track the impact of films comes into play. I actually wrote this down because I knew somebody was going to ask this. The film had a very small budget for what ended up being a very high profile picture. It was made for a little more than $11 million. And then it grossed about $43 million at the theaters. And I don't think, no, that was 2019. That was not a COVID sort of cutting off theater viewership. So that was basically its run. It made money. It did well. But it didn't make anywhere near the money that a film like Django or even, I think Vampire Hunter even made quite a bit more. So my questions for that are, yes, it projected the things that more serious sort of observers of slavery on the silver screen wanted to see. But I wonder if the reception of it hints at my final point from the lecture. Will we see more films like Harriet if they didn't make enough money or if they didn't make a big enough footprint? And the reason I mentioned those different mediums is it's so hard to track how many people later saw it on Hulu or Netflix or Roku or Fire, all these different ways that you can basically avoid leaving your house, but you can watch stuff that used to be in theaters. So it's possible that tens of millions more people saw Harriet than we would be aware of just from the old way of tracing the box office. I hope that we've sort of hit a turning point there, but there have been times in the past, like with Amistad, where people thought, look, we finally showed this, we finally did it, and then it's a decade before we get another one. So really time will tell, I think. But the current political climate, especially the discussion we're having about race and violence in the United States right now, I would imagine that is going to help prod studios to exploring this more seriously.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's going to be very interesting to see what comes down over the next few years. A question several people have asked in different ways regards other countries and cinematic representations of slavery. And again, I think this, the scope of your talk and expertise is already massive, just including the US, but any thoughts on how other countries and their movie industries have handled the subject of slavery?
For the most part, they are lagging well behind what you would see in the United States. Well, I'll put parameters on that and say the cases that I'm directly aware of are well behind. The Russians especially loved Gone with the Wind. It had its own sort of industry in Russia, but Russia does not go through a civil rights movement in the decades following the release of Gone with the Wind. So they don't necessarily get the large scale corrective. The clips of Song of the South that I used to show my students before it became a little easier to access were from a German version of the film, because nations that felt detached from American slavery didn't have the qualms about showing it depicted in ways that were not truthful or historically realistic. So whereas Disney basically did its very best to make you think Song of the South never existed, other countries, they don't care. You can still buy it on DVD, or I guess VHS, depending on where you. Surely somebody still has a VCR. So generally speaking, because they're outside the context of our chronology of our lost cause, our Jim Crow era, our civil rights movement, our sort of racial reckoning that we get in the 60s and 70s that leads to blaxploitation, and then what we hope is sort of this new era of dealing with things racially. And I know we said that in the 90s, we said that when President Obama was elected, people have said that in the last few months. It's hard to tell if we're really having lots of little new eras or if it's kind of one elongated one that started maybe in the 90s. But it'll be interesting to see. I think the telling thing will be, do other nations pick up Harriet? Do they pick up the films that go against what they had readily accepted as sort of being Americana for a century? Because it's not just Americans that like the Moonlight and Magnolia. The Soviets liked Rhett Butler too. Everybody liked Rhett Butler, right? That's a difficult thing to displace.
Yeah, thank you. More specific question now. One attendee says, thank you for defending the Free State of Jones, and goes on to say, at the time it came out, I spent a lot of time trying to convince people that it is not a white savior movie. I think it's much more complicated than that. Can you discuss that further?
Absolutely. And I will, full disclosure, I know Vicky fairly well, and she is among the best historians that our field has to offer. And that movie is largely based on a lot of the work she did uncovering the story of Newt Knight and the Free State of Jones. I think part of the problem with the sort of white savior debate is because it's the white savior debate and it is often being had amongst white academics, there is an aversion to ever going in this, to allowing it to be a positive thing. Newt Knight does lead an interracial rebellion against the Confederacy in Jones County, Mississippi. A Canadian carpenter really does help Solomon Northup achieve his freedom. Those are integral parts of the story. Those stories would not have played out the same way without those characters. But when we say, oh, you know, that's Matthew McConaughey being the white savior again, and part of that is his track record because of other films he's done. He's sort of guilty of, he's a repeat offender, we should say. But so it's a hard debate to have, because if you want to argue that middle sort of nuanced point, you're the one that has to kind of take on the, oh, well, he's the one saying slaves couldn't free themselves, which of course that's the story we would all like to hear. But in many ways, that ends up selling short the horrors of slavery, right? If it was really that easy, you know, we wouldn't be watching Birth of a Nation about the Nat Turner revolt and how it you know, is just cracked down on and everybody gets killed. So it's a really complicated thing. I felt like Free State of Jones, and as much as it showed the war and the Reconstruction era, was great. I think they got a little bit cute trying to jump back and forth in time to later cover miscegenation cases in the 20th century. And I think in some ways it dragged. It was almost like The Last Lord of the Rings ending 8 times. Free State of Jones had multiple endings, and it made it hard for people to track the true meaning of the film. But to pivot just a little bit, I recall sitting in theaters watching The Birth of a Nation, the Nate Parker version, and I was actually the only moviegoer, the only white moviegoer in the theater, and numerous people around me were crying through the film. And it was an interesting position to be in, because I imagined for the most part, for most of the century, the script was flipped, and the black moviegoer who would have been watching that film, or who might have been watching Free State of Jones, would have been the one or two in a theater packed with white patrons. So I felt like we were at least making progress on that front, and we're at least willing to throw the stories out there. Now, whether Twitter or other corners of the internet like them, you know, is harder to say. But it's also hard to tell at this point: is Hollywood going to cater to that, or again, are they just going to cater to what makes money? I'm sorry, that was a very rambling response to Free State of Jones. If you haven't seen it, it is absolutely worth watching.
Thank you. And I'm afraid to say, I really enjoyed our conversation. We are just about out of time, though. And I really want to thank the audience. We had, over 200 people sitting in their offices and living rooms participating in the event tonight. And I want to thank each of you for taking the time to join us this evening. We really appreciate your attendance and the great questions you asked. And by the way, I apologize. We were not able to get to all the questions. We received dozens of really good questions. We were able to get, I think, to a majority of them, so I'm glad about that, but apologies if we didn't quite get to your question. But most of all, I want to thank our speaker tonight, Dr. Hulbert, for sharing his expertise. I hope you won't mind me saying that you're right about being a movie nerd. You've put that on full display tonight with your incredibly wide-ranging knowledge and understanding of American movies about slavery and so much else besides. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And I encourage everyone to check out the website. You can sign up for the remaining events this spring at the website civilwar.bt.edu. Thank you very much.